A mysterious ritual that spreads across New England
And they cut her heart out.
and beyond.
This is the timeline. Look at
Oh
that.
my goodness.
Graves broken into, and the dead turned into a horrifying form of medicine.
Cannibalism is essentially what is happening.
How are these rites of death linked to the birth of American independence?
Journalists saw these practices as a threat to civilization.
The supernatural versus science, a battle that goes on for more than a century, then vanishes into rumor and legend.
Many people just seem to be in denial about it.
The idea of vampirism is out there.
Did New England farmers really fight vampires in order to fight something even deadlier? History may be more shocking than we ever imagined. Today, technology forces the past to give up its secrets. Newly discovered documents turn history on its head, and discoveries in ancient archives reveal startling stories we never knew. Griswold, Connecticut, November 1990. Archaeologist Nick Bellantoni supervises the excavation of a crude brick-lined grave and uncovers a scene of horror.
I was like, I've never seen this before.
Inside the grave is the skeleton of a man, but his skull has been pulled off his neck. 2 leg bones are crossed on his chest, and the ribs are broken above his heart.
No, I was totally befuddled. I just had no idea what I was looking at or why.
The mystery had begun several days earlier.
I remember the discovery in Griswold from 1990 from when I was a child. A couple of kids are playing on a hill, they're rolling down the hill at a sand and gravel pit, and they accidentally dislodge a couple of skulls. We'd had a serial killer recently in Connecticut, so people were afraid that this might have been somewhere that he had been storing his victims.
Well, we were contacted by the medical examiner's office, looked at the 2 skulls, saw that the cortical loss and decomposition was there, and realized we had something old, not part of a modern criminal investigation.
But if the skulls aren't evidence of a serial killer, what are they?
So this is the modern satellite data of the area.
Okay.
3 decades later, graphic artist Edmund Earle is reconstructing the site where the skulls were found, using Nick's data.
What we've brought in as well is the historic maps of the time. So we can overlay them so we get to see both at once.
Excellent.
The gravel pit of the 1990s has been transformed over the last 30 years.
It looks like a typical suburban neighborhood now.
But Edmund strips away layers of time to the 1800s, before the gravel pit was built.
So if we were to peel that away, is it just farmland?
If farmland, pasture.
And a cemetery for the farmers. A rural cemetery abandoned, forgotten, and later covered by the sand and gravel pit. Out of the gravel pit in the early 1990s, Nick and his team unearthed 29 skeletons from the 17 and 1800s.
These were hard-working New England farmers. They were buried naked and wrapped with a sheet, a shroud.
Although no tombstones identify the dead, parts of some coffins survive, with brass tacks giving the initials and ages of death for 3 people buried near each other. A child, NB13, a middle-aged woman, IB46, and a middle-aged man, JB55.
They were laid out next to each other with the child to the side. That led us to believe that JB and IB were husband and wife, and NB was the child.
And JB55 was the man whose grave was broken into. Is Nick investigating a crime scene after all?
When Nick uncovered it, and when we saw the bones crossed, I didn't understand that at all.
Edmund Earle creates a digital version of JB55 so that Nick can re-examine the evidence. bone by bone.
We saw that the femurs had been crossed over the chest area.
All right, let me do that
do
then.
that?
Yep. So like,
That's it. And then, of course, we saw the cranium was decapitated and rotated in the opposite direction.
so definitely removed intentionally, right?
Clearly.
And there's more. Cut marks on the bones reveal JB-55 was deliberately dismembered at least 5 years after death.
Somebody's come to the graveyard, dig into him, rearranges his skeleton, covers him back over, and we don't find him again until 1990.
Nick determines from the design of the coffin that JB-55 died before 1840.
In the back where those trees.
That makes his mutilation even more mysterious. Because some early 19th century New Englanders were very specific about burying the dead.
These farmers were facing the east, and it's believed on the day of resurrection, Christ will come up with the sun out of the east and withdraw you from your housing so you can join in that.
So whoever broke into JB-55's grave wanted to turn him away from the hope of resurrection.
So you just saw this
I just
as
saw
it
this.
was found mutilated.
And had to try to figure out what
Figure
I
out
was
why.
looking at.
Then, a strange local legend provides a clue.
One of my colleagues had suggested, did you ever hear the story of the Jewett City vampire?
The story went back to the middle of the 19th century. Just 2 miles from Griswold, in the neighborhood called Jewett City, several men in a farming family mysteriously died, one after another. Until a corpse, thought to be a vampire preying on the family, was dug up and burned.
These warding off measures were ways of killing the dead, preventing the dead from coming to torment the living.
Is it a tall tale or something more?
I want to know where this came from.
Searching through old library records, Nick strikes pay dirt. An 1854 account from a regional newspaper. In Jewett City, the dead were supposed to feed upon the living. Incredibly, the legend is based on a real event. Between 1845 and 1851, 3 members of the Ray family die in the prime of life. In 1854, another of the Rays falls ill.
They had no way of stopping it.
The living fear that one of the dead is to blame.
Coming up out of the grave to feed off the vital forces of the living.
And so, according to the newspaper, family and friends actually dig up the dead bodies and cut out their vital organs.
The last one to die, he was found with blood in his heart, and they took that to mean that he was undead, and they burned him to save the other son.
Does this story shed new light on the mystery of JB-55? Like the Rays, was he dug up after death as a suspected vampire? If so, then his skeleton isn't evidence of an unsolved crime, but of a forgotten ritual.
I really came to realize that those ribs were probably fractured because they got into his grave to see if he was undead.
But after 5 or more years, JB-55's heart had probably rotted away.
And when they couldn't find a heart, they had to make a decision. Is he undead or not? And I think they probably decided to decapitate him, uproot his legs, just to be sure.
If JB-55 died about 15 years before the Rays were exhumed, did his vampire ritual inspire theirs? If so, could there be more vampires?
2 cases in the same town, maybe less than a couple decades apart, shows that this was not uncommon.
JB-55 was certainly different from the vampires of popular books and movies.
Anyone in the 20th and 21st century, when they think of vampires, are going to think of everything out of Dracula and Bram Stoker.
An aristocratic count biting the neck, able to transform into a bat or a mist.
But JB55 was a farmer, not an aristocrat. And weren't vampires a superstition from places in Central Europe, like Transylvania? What were such things doing in 19th century New England? While researching into JB55 continued, Nick began investigating the wider mystery of American vampires. To do that, he needed a vampire expert. Fortunately, there was one, and he specialized in New England. Michael Bell, a folklorist, not only knew about the Jewett City vampires, he was researching several other cases of vampires' exhumations and burnings.
I've tried to visit every cemetery that I know there are vampires buried.
Bell's research begins in 1981, investigating an eerie incident that took place just half an hour's drive from Griswold in Jewett City, Connecticut, across the border in Exeter, Rhode Island. It was something that had been hinted at by the 20th century horror writer and Rhode Island native, H.P. Lovecraft.
As lately as 1892, an Exeter community exhumed a dead body and ceremoniously burnt its heart in order to prevent certain alleged visitations injurious to the public health and peace.
The first New England vampire story that I ever heard was Mercy Brown.
Growing up, I heard that Route 102, which ran right near my house, was also called Vampire Highway. I remember hearing from classmates of mine that there was a vampire the next town over that roamed a graveyard at night.
The Mercy Brown story was something that we all used to tell each other when we were kids, sitting around campfires or, with the flashlights up under our faces, under the bed at night.
How does the tale of Mercy Brown connect with JB55, the Rays, and other American vampires? How widespread was the ritual of exhumation and burning? And how did it begin? Of all the stories of alleged vampires in New England, none is more notorious than that of Mercy Lena Brown of Exeter, Rhode Island.
When my children were still young, some of the kids used to talk about the legend of Mercy Brown. People would be calling Mercy Brown a vampire.
I first heard about Mercy Brown from someone who was a descendant from her family.
As a kid, when we went to the cemetery, there was Mercy Brown, and they say, well, don't go running over there because of this awful thing that took place years ago.
In early March 1892, George Brown of Exeter, Rhode Island, has already lost his wife and 2 daughters to a strange, wasting, fatal illness. Now, his only son, Edwin, is also dying.
The family had come down with some disease, young and old, all of a sudden. And anything that they did didn't seem to stop it.
People in the community got together and put pressure on George Brown to perform this old-time theory.
The theory is that one of the dead women is preying on Edwin. But which one? The only way to tell is to open their graves and examine their vital organs.
I just can't imagine how Mr. Brown would have felt. The community wanting this horrible ritual to be played out.
According to local papers, George did not believe in the old-time theory, but he agreed to have it done to satisfy these friends and neighbors who were concerned.
But George Brown refuses to be at the cemetery himself for the exhumations on March 17, 1892. Instead, the area's medical examiner, Dr. Harold Metcalf, who tended to George's daughter Mercy Lena in her final weeks, is paid to supervise the exhumations.
They exhumed the bodies of Mary Eliza, the mother, and Mary Olive, the older sister who had died. And according to newspaper accounts, they were basically decomposed.
Then, they take the younger daughter from the above-ground crypt where her body has been stored until the frozen New England ground thaws enough for burial.
And they cut her heart out. There was blood in the heart.
Mercy Lena Brown, who died at the age of 19, just 9 weeks earlier, still has blood in her liver and her heart. The men conclude she is the vampire.
Dr. Metcalf said there was nothing unusual in her state because she had been frozen since January, but the attendants thought she was the one responsible.
And they burnt the heart, took the ashes and done something with it.
According to this version of the vampire ritual, the ashes of Mercy Brown's vital organs were to be mixed with water into a potion.
The ashes were supposed to be fed to Edwin, her brother.
You know, it sounds horrific to us, but you know what? It might have been considered a form of inoculation.
Did Edwin Brown drink the ashes of his sister's heart? On that point, both newspapers and family legends are silent. One thing is certain, though. Despite the vampire ritual, Edwin dies just a few weeks later. Mercy Brown is news in the 1890s. But in the 20th century, her story, like that of the vampires of nearby Jewett City, Connecticut, is dismissed as something too bizarre to have really happened.
The memory of weird events has a tendency to become lost, and many people just seem to be in denial about it.
But then, after Nick Bellantoni unearths the anonymous male skeleton, dubbed JB55 from the brass tacks on his coffin, the mutilated bones offer stunning proof that the vampire exhumations were real.
All right, so to me, this is pretty exciting to be holding the coffin of a suspected vampire. So this is like hard evidence,
And I think
an artifact.
that's a great marriage between, you know, history, folklore, and archaeology.
For decades, Nick and Michael have shared information on the vampires of New England. One question that still puzzles them: why was the American vampire so different from the European bloodsucker? The modern idea of the vampire spreads through Europe after an incident in what is now Serbia around 1726.
This was investigated and written down, thus giving us these records.
According to official government reports, a soldier named Arnold Paul says he was attacked by a Turkish vampire. Believing that vampire victims become vampires themselves, Paul smears himself with blood and dirt from the vampire's grave, and even eats the dirt as a kind of antidote.
You inoculate yourself with a little bit of the bad stuff, and then you're protected.
But according to the official report, the cure doesn't work. Paul dies and becomes a vampire, attacking men and women in his village, until authorities dig up his grave, stake him through the heart, cut off his head, and burn him to ashes. Could this account of using blood and dirt from the grave and burning the undead be the origin of the American idea of a potion made from a vampire's ashes? In 1732, newspapers in London pick up the Central European story of Arnold Paul and introduce the English language to the Slavic word vampire. But Nick Bellantoni finds that vampires don't appear in an American newspaper until 1765, more than 30 years later.
Those newspapers went throughout the colony. So the idea of vampirism is out there.
A little over 20 years later, in the 1780s, an altered version of that idea has taken root in Massachusetts. The Reverend Justice Forward writes to a friend that 3 women in his family have mysteriously died from an illness that now threatens his daughter. The Reverend writes that he has consulted many about opening the graves to see signs of the dead preying on the living. But he isn't referring to the European kind of vampire.
It was killing from a distance, drawing the vital force of living family members into itself, into the vital organs where it was existing.
The supernatural in New England is very hard to define. Satan being active in this world was just as much natural as God working in this world.
The fact is, for 2 centuries, there is good reason to believe these supernatural tales. A predatory phantom does stalk the countryside of New England. Silent, invisible, terrifying. But it isn't a vampire. It's something far more dangerous. Were America's vampire rituals actually attempts at battling a real-life menace? The answer may lie in Silver Spring, Maryland, at the National Museum of Health and Medicine, where research is being conducted on the bones of the alleged vampire, JB55.
There was always a mystery about JB55. Who was he, and what could we learn more about him from his remains?
Could JB55's bones explain why this 19th century Connecticut farmer was attacked in his grave as a vampire? Especially these bones, ribs with small white marks.
The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th ribs of JB55 exhibit lesions that are consistent with a chronic pulmonary infection, particularly pulmonary tuberculosis.
Tuberculosis, a disease that kills by eating away at the lungs until the victim can no longer take in enough oxygen to survive.
The real vampire, the bacterium with fangs, as one nurse called it.
When JB55 was alive in the 19th century, tuberculosis was called consumption because it seemed to consume you from within.
You grow very thin, your skin loses color, you become pallid. One of the signals of consumption is a terrible cough, which brings up blood. As you near death, you end up looking more and more like a vampire yourself.
As archaeologist Nick Bellantoni joins forces with folklorist Michael Bell, he finds more and more evidence of a clear link between American vampires and consumption.
The association is prominent in every case. The Ray family were suffering from consumption. And then as we started to work into the Mercy Brown family, there pops consumption again.
It's not surprising that these farmers would turn to just about any folk remedy that they could think of. And one of those was you would seek out someone who had been buried and seemed perhaps to have blood in the heart.
But were the vampires really full of fresh blood?
Basically what ends up happening in decomposition, especially in its early stages, gases are forming inside. It dislodges fluids, purge fluids that people misinterpreted.
They didn't know it was caused by a germ at that time. A tiny animal that's killing you, I think that would have rang just as absurd.
Most of Michael's evidence for the vampire rituals comes from accounts in period newspapers. But could there be other physical evidence that survives to this day? Michael has learned of a provocative clue along the Rhode Island-Connecticut border, in an old family cemetery, now overseen by a new family.
I'm Carrie.
Hi, nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you too.
Yeah.
Do you want to go in?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I spent a summer redoing the wall
Yeah,
because
the
that was
wall.
all underground
The wall looks
previously.
great, yeah.
After Carrie Vale and her husband bought the property in 2009, they began restoring the cemetery, including the old stone wall.
And that's Nancy's stone.
Yes, and they burned her on the corner of the wall.
19th century newspapers say 19-year-old Nancy Young died of consumption in April 1827. Her family exhumed and burned her. Hoping to stop the disease from taking them, they inhaled the smoke.
And they say that it smoldered till at least dawn.
So they exhumed Nancy, took her over there, burned her body.
Yes. When we recreated the wall, the stones we started turning up were scorched. They were black.
Oh.
Charred stones. Possible evidence of a vampire ritual 2 centuries ago. A ritual that failed.
You did all that to your child, and then your other child dies anyways, followed by another child and another child. That's a burden on your soul that I can't imagine.
But aside from old stones, newspapers, and family stories, is there any evidence that the vampire ritual was actually possible? Human flesh burns at about 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. And while outdoor bonfires can reach temperatures of 2,000 degrees, researcher Katie Gagnon has heard that the vampire ritual could be aided by old New England technology.
Pleased to meet you. Nice to meet you too.
Katie's going to put that story to the test with blacksmith Jesse Savage.
There was actually a case where the heart was burned on a blacksmith forge.
Jesse hand cranks air into the forge so the heat can vastly exceed a normal bonfire.
What we're going to do here today is we are going to burn a pig heart, which is very close to a human heart.
And how hot do these burn?
Temperatures can range from, 2,500 to 3,000 degrees very easily.
Wow.
So.
Within minutes, the heart is nothing but ash. And with a little water, they have a simulation of the anti-vampire potion.
I've drank much worse things in my life. I can taste a little grit.
Katie has now witnessed that the vampire ritual could be performed.
Cannibalism is essentially what is happening, whether it's ash or flesh. It's still cannibalism to eat the remains of a body.
Cannibalism and desecration were accepted by many. Nick and Exeter historian Sheila Reynolds Boothroyd see this as graphic artist Edmund Earle turns Michael's list of confirmed and suspected vampire exhumations into an interactive map.
This is the timeline. Look
Oh
at
my
that.
goodness.
80 cases and counting. Were all these vampire rituals performed in secret, under cover of darkness? Surprisingly, no.
1796, February, the town council of Cumberland, Rhode Island.
A man requests public permission to try an experiment, digging up his dead daughter to save the life of his remaining daughter. In a dramatic decision, the Cumberland Town Council votes to let the experiment proceed.
The town council entry says, and after this experiment is completed, then the body should be reburied in a decent manner.
The small estate has the most exhumations, beating New York's 10, with at least 17, half a dozen, within a few miles of Mercy Brown's grave.
Man, look at poor Rhode Island.
If Rhode Island was the Transylvania of America, then Exeter was the Transylvania of Rhode Island.
Of Rhode Island.
After the vampire ritual, what was left of Mercy Lena Brown was buried in her grave. But stories would grow up around her, including the rumor that she helped inspire the most famous vampire legend of all, Dracula. Mercy Brown of Exeter, Rhode Island, may be the best known of all the New England vampire cases. And the way her story is remembered reveals just how our attitudes toward vampires have evolved. In 1892, after Mercy Brown's heart and liver are cut out and burned, newspapers report it as an act of barbarism.
19th century journalists saw these practices as a threat to civilization. It's become, I guess you would call it infotainment. The modern interpretation of Mercy Brown is that she was a vampire and she was killing off her family. Some of the family members had bite marks on their necks. And actually Mercy came out of the grave and visited some of them. And I always tried to say, no, 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 that's not what it was.
Today, Mercy Brown's tombstone has become a kind of shrine.
I have yet to go to Mercy Brown's headstone and not see something, some little token that indicates to me that she's still quite beloved.
In 1996, someone stole her tombstone as a souvenir. It was recovered a week later, and then secured with a cement block and an iron band. That only added to Mercy's legend.
Because of the internet exploiting the vampire stories, it just creates more of a false story about a very unfortunate young girl.
Now, what did they call it? Did they call it a crypt?
Crypt.
Yeah.
Vampire fans used to sneak into Mercy's old crypt until the town of Exeter took action, as local historian Sheila Reynolds Boothroyd shows Michael Bell and Katie Gagnon.
Oh, okay.
Careful.
Oh, they've blocked it all up. So there's actually concrete blocks.
There is.
It's a solid wall.
Yep. We really don't want to exploit the fact that a young girl died of consumption. It's just not right.
When Mercy Brown died in 1892, her father may have assumed that was the painful end of her story. But thousands of miles away in England, an American newspaper account of the Rhode Island vampires ends up in the hands of novelist Bram Stoker and is found among his notes after his death. Which raises the question, did Stoker, the author of Dracula, use Mercy Brown as the basis for his character Lucy, a young woman who becomes a vampire and is staked in her coffin? The article is from 1896, the year before Dracula was published. Did Mercy Brown inspire Bram Stoker? Michael Bell, Katie Gagnon, Nick Bellantoni, and Faye Ringel examine the facts.
So, do we have an article that Bram Stoker had in his notes?
Yeah, right here.
Is there a name in it?
Nobody's name.
Nobody's name.
It's pretty obvious who he was talking about if you know the stories. There's no way Stoker could have known that unless he went back to the newspapers from 1892.
But he wasn't touring in the United States in 1892. He was touring the United States in 1896. This clipping ended up with his notes and papers because he was fascinated by vampires, given that he'd been working on it since 1890.
In fact, Stoker's notes show he had his plot and characters almost 2 years before Mercy Brown died.
So the theory that somehow Bram Stoker was inspired by the Rhode Island vampire case really just does not hold water.
Although Mercy Lena Brown lived in an age of cameras and phonographs, there are no pictures of her, no recordings of her voice. What did she leave behind to tell people who she really was?
Michael, I have something here that might interest you.
Historians in Exeter have recently come across another piece of evidence, a public document from the 1880s, a school attendance book.
Is Lena Brown?
Wow. Lena Brown, who was actually Mercy Lena Brown.
8 years old.
Yeah. That's great. It brings them to life.
It brings
puts
the people to life,
You
exactly.
know, it gives them a context to school, where they live, what
Yep.
they did.
Right.
It also shows that you just never know where the information is going to turn up.
It's true.
Or when.
The artifacts of Mercy Brown's life and her legend will keep her name alive. But what about JB-55, the skeleton that proved to a new generation that vampire rituals were real? Is there any information about him? Shortly after his discovery, experts are able to give the 19th century farmer a face.
So this reconstruction of JB was done in the 1990s by the Smithsonian, and you get a sense of his character that you don't get just from looking at the skeletal remains.
Now, almost 3 decades later, can scientists learn more about this mysterious New England farmer? Will the bones of JB-55 finally reveal his name? Almost 3 decades since the mysterious skeleton of JB-55 was discovered, scientists at the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System's DNA lab are working to learn this man's name.
This is the same procedure that we use to identify missing service members.
They managed to get usable DNA from one of JB-55's thigh bones. Then, JB's genetic profile is run against a public DNA database. The result? A last name.
Barber.
But if B is Barber, what is J?
We weren't sure what the J stood for. The J could have stood for any popular name during that time. So Katie, the genealogist, searched J. Barber in Connecticut death records.
And we looked through archives, records, library basements, and we were able to confirm that there were barbers in the area at the time that he might have died. There were also cases of tuberculosis in the area when he might have lived there. Once I had the surname Barber, I checked the town records and archives, and I found a Nathan, son of John.
So NB-13 is most likely Nathan Barber. And JB-55 is most likely his father, John. But there's still another Barber waiting for her name.
Did you find an IB? There was a female or...
Right. Unfortunately, I didn't. So I was hoping to find something in one of the marriage records, perhaps, but she didn't show up.
When did John Barber's wife die? Was she ill with consumption? And was her husband exhumed in an attempt to save her? If so, by whom? And when? The investigation of the vampire skeleton will continue. Today, it's hard to imagine the vampire rituals that once took place across New England. But what brought them to an end? The saga of the American vampire seems to decline following the Civil War, with the rise of embalming and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's body is embalmed, and over the next 20 years, the process becomes more efficient and affordable.
So as people started embalming their loved ones, in a sense, you're taking away anything that some evil spirit might want to inhabit.
More and more, corpses have formaldehyde in their veins, not blood. And without blood, there are no vampires. There was also progress in the battle against consumption itself. Scientists finally develop an antibiotic for tuberculosis in the 1940s. And by the 1950s, new drugs make a striking impact against the disease. Today, tuberculosis still kills more than 1 million people each year, primarily in Asia, Africa, and South America. But in the United States and the industrialized world, tuberculosis is a shadow of what it was during the time of the vampire rituals.
Now we can relax and enjoy our vampires because they're not around anymore. People don't do that anymore. People don't believe in that anymore. So it's not a threat to us in our civilization today.
But the question remains, how did these rituals take root in America? Michael thinks it's connected to the American Revolution and Great Britain's German-speaking hired guns, the Hessians.
And the Hessians, let's remember, were not all just Germans. They were mercenaries, and they came from many parts of Europe.
Have some of them heard of vampires and of the ways to deal with the dead who prey on the living? And do they transform the superstition into a supposed cure for America's consumption crisis?
Traveling doctors may have come over during the Revolution as Hessians, stayed here for a while, at least long enough to be able to communicate this ritual to people.
Michael finds evidence in a Connecticut newspaper from June 1784, the earliest known reference to the vampire ritual. A letter to the editor complains about a foreign quack doctor who asserts that consumption can be cured by digging up the dead and burning their organs.
So to me, that was a clue. A certain quack doctor, a foreigner, cutting out the hearts, looking for fresh blood in the heart, burning the hearts. All of these things are found in various parts of Europe.
So is this like selling snake oil?
My belief is that they were basically just con artists.
Okay.
Preying on people's misfortunes.
I never thought that there was a European connection. I think that somehow those are thoughts and remedies that have arisen all over the world. I mean, they're found among the Aborigines of Australia, in Africa,
Sure.
in Asia.
But do they cut out hearts, burn them to ashes, and
No.
feed the ashes to the living? So that connects Europe to New England.
The graves of the former vampires of New England are largely forgotten today. But there are some who keep the legends alive even now. As Nick and Michael find, when the secretary of the Jewett City Cemetery Association escorts them to the graves of the men Nick first read about 30 years ago, the Jewett City Vampires, the Ray family, where an unknown fan has left a tribute.
Looks like we got a trail of fangs over here.
Yeah, those are fangs.
But it's amazing how people are still involved with the vampire story here.
For believers, the vampire exhumations never failed. Even if the sick person died, that only meant they were too far gone to help.
Here's where Henry Nelson is buried. This is the one they were trying to save. But you can see by the date, 1854, he died this right after they did the ceremony, so.
But they thought this was all related to vampirism. It's absurd, but they believed in it. That was it.
Well, I don't even know if you have to believe in it to do it. I think you're so desperate that you'll try anything. So you've got to kind of put yourself in the position of like, if I don't give the consent to do this, and somebody else dies and keeps dying, then maybe it's on me. I'm responsible.
Well, you know, think about it this way in a modern concept. I mean, we have all this great medical technology, but God forbid, if a pandemic hits us where we cannot stop the deaths, people are going to do irrational behaviors.
They still
just
do.
out of fear and love.
Yeah.
And that's really what this was all about.